Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Ben Pink Dandelion, and along with Rhiannon Grant, we look after the work of the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies based at Woodbrook. And I'd like to welcome you all to the 2024 George Richardson Lecture. This is a lecture that was set up at the Centre for Quaker Studies at the University of Sunderland in 1995. So I think we're in our 29th year. And this year we're holding the lecture in the middle of a joint conference between the Conference of Quaker Historians and Archivists, Quaker Studies Research Association, and the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies. And what's wonderful is that over this weekend, we're actually in the company of 8 lecturers. So that's really quite phenomenal. And it's lovely to see some familiar faces. The lecture is jointly organised by QSRA, the Quaker Studies Research Association, and the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies. It's named after George Richardson, who was a grocer in the northeast of England, a Quaker, a 19th century Quaker, and it's said that his letter to the Friend in the early 1860s led to the formation of the Friends Foreign Missionary Association. And because the lecture began in the University of Sunderland, it was named after a local Quaker. So the lecture, as you can tell, is being recorded. It will later be the lecture itself, not the discussion, will be on the Woodbrook website in due course. And a printed version of the lecture will then appear in Quaker Studies. And if you don't know, Quaker Studies is a fully refereed journal that covers every aspect of the areas of different areas of Quaker scholarship. And if you haven't seen it already, it's freely available online. And I would also encourage people to consider submitting to it. There's also Quaker History, which is also refereed and very fine journal, and that also is really worth looking at. So the lecture and our conversation following it will take no more than 90 minutes, and we will be finishing today by 9 p.m. UK time. It's a great pleasure this year to welcome Nigel Smith, who is the William and Annie S. Paton Foundation Professor of Ancient and Modern Literature at Princeton, previously, before that, at Oxford, has written widely on Andrew Marvell and Milton, and is probably best known to us, though, as the editor of the Penguin 1998 edition of the Journal of George Fox. I only met Nigel yesterday, but it's been a delight. Amazing set of personal connections with Geoffrey Nuttall and a whole host of illustrious scholars, as well as, which we can see, but those online might not be able to, a great sartorial elegance as well. So it's been a great pleasure getting to know you, Nigel. Likewise, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Nigel. His lecture is called Back to the Light, A Fresh Approach, and Nigel will begin when he's ready. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. It is a great pleasure, and as I say in a few minutes, an honor to be asked to do this lecture. I've actually, as things have turned out, and as I'll try to explain, I've been away from Quaker studies, which for me means pretty much early Quaker studies. Nothing, I used to joke with people that I wasn't interested in anything after April 1660, and nothing before about 1641 either. But I've softened at the edges over time. But I think partly because I did leave England and go and work in America 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago, I've actually, and I didn't expect it, lost contact with the kind of people I used to talk to who were basically people involved in the history of dissent. So this is the invitation. I immediately responded to it and said yes, because it's a return. And I'll try and make sense of. So I've returned to my early work, and indeed to Fox's journal, and I'll try to make sense of what that means to me in the course of the lecture. So whether it's a fresh approach or whether it's back to the light, we'll find out. And it's really a plea for thinking about literary studies as part of Quaker studies, and how the two might fit together, and what we do in literature departments, and in this country that does mean English literature departments, as a kind of method that can illuminate the early history of dissent. But it also moves into where I've gone in my own scholarship, and talks about the second period of Quakerism, and we heard from Professor Murphy today about that, and I say quite a bit about Furley later in the lecture, and then end up with some general reflections. And there is a personal bit to the lecture that I'll start with. So, like a Wordsworthian poet, I always feel existentially embedded in place, wherever I am. And I live in Pennington, New Jersey. And that surely should mean something to you. Now, how Pennington got its name is it was a road junction in Hopewell Township. Hopewell Township is the next township to Princeton Township. And in fact, Hopewell Township had a Baptist academy, and some of the people in it went off to form Brown University, which they're very proud of in Hopewell. And there was a little road junction inside Hopewell Township, and it was called Pennytown, as in place of no significance whatsoever. And it got some ambitious residents who decided to make a little corporation there. And they thought from Pennytown to Pennington, which would fit with the kind of name that will make you look good around in those parts. So although it does relate to one of the Penningtons, there was an Arthur Pennington who was a local administrator at the end of the 19th century. And I think they were trying to hit on his name and the association with the great Quaker family. It's a very indirect route. But Pennington is 8 miles west of Princeton, and it lies in between Princeton and Pennington lies Province Line Road. Oh. Yes. We need to wake it up. Do we need? Okay. So, place. There's New Jersey. Can you see Trenton, the state capital, where you should never go after dark? And Princeton is to the northwest of it, and Pennington is basically just to the west of Princeton, close to the Pennsylvania border, and the Delaware River. And we heard from Andrew Murphy that New Jersey was divided between East and West Jersey in the 1670s as it became a British administration. And Robert Berkeley was the absentia governor of East New Jersey, and West New Jersey ended up in Quaker hands, and Quaker families settled it. I live in the very beginning of West Jersey, and because I'm the sort of person who cares about history and I look for its traces. I'm always aware that I'm in Quaker country, and Princeton is an 18th century Scottish Presbyterian university that sits in Quaker land. The first known resident of Princeton was an English physician from Massachusetts who was required to leave Massachusetts because he'd given safe house to Quakers. So the resonance is big, but as Andrew said, everyone likes dissenters in England because they're persecuted and against the grain. And when you get to America, you realize that they're really in charge, and it feels very different. So the colonial province came to the English in 1642, and West Jersey was sold for administrative and settlement to the Friends, like bits of East Jersey. I used to live in Princeton near the now abandoned Quaker village of Stony Brook, which is where the Princeton Friends Meeting House still stands, built in 1711. And there's a Friends school next door, which I don't know, I think that must be a much later foundation, but it still is open. It is on the edge of the grounds of the famous Institute for Advanced Study, which is not part of the university. That's not widely known. But the Institute for Advanced Study was made famous by its first major hire, Albert Einstein, and where the land was given by a Quaker farming family, the Oldens. And the director's house at the Institute is the farmhouse of the Oldens, expanded several times, although Einstein's desk and other bits of his furniture are in the old original farmhouse. I got inside it because I was able to supply the new director, who has English connections, with a year's supply of mint sauce. He confessed to me a craving for mint sauce, and I said, I know which supermarket to go to. Including his desk. So having said that, it's almost a surprise to me to be here today, because I've become a bit severed from Quaker studies, since I edited the journal. And I've written a fair amount about the earliest Quakers, especially in the context of other radical figures and groups of the English Revolution period. And as has been said, I edited Fox's journal, although I think in a way which might be considered heretical, if I can put it like that, because so much of it isn't in the journal. And I've written articles about John Perrott and Robert Rich, but I'm not sure how much has been made of them, or how much has been made of the journal, and I don't hear much about how it's gone down, at least insofar as I can tell from printed and online responses. Although it has surprised me to talk to people in this conference who say they actually read it and use it. It's true that I've written about several other topics and authors, and that as a professional literary scholar, most of my time is taken up with teaching undergraduates and helping to create the university teachers of tomorrow. I try to keep a hand in all of the fields in which I have published, but sometimes you appear to disappear from view where you have written, or you lose a sense of where you fit in a field you've once been very involved in. Sometimes I felt that the journal, the Penguin edition of the journal, has disappeared from view. Rosemary Moore said in print more than 20 years ago that soon after my Fox edition appeared, that she thought it would become the most popular version of those available, and she had some regrets about that, because the Nichols edition included so many more of the documents. So it reproduces the many letters that were reproduced that are printed in the first edition of 1694. And of course, that's true. And I always assumed that for people who wanted to use Nichols, it would still be there. And I think that is true. And the Nichols edition is a great achievement. But with the exception of Hilary Heinz's work, I don't think it's the case that my edition is used very much, certainly by scholars. I'm not sure that it's, I think Nichols is still the scholarly edition because it's got so much more information in it, which is fine by me, except that I do add some things in my notes and in my introduction. It would be nice to know what people thought about that and whether they used it. So Hilary makes excellent use of my book and actually takes me to task for various things I did, but she also runs with lots of the things that I suggested. In her 2013 book about Fox and early Quaker literature, and she does cite it a lot, but in her 2015 essay in the volume on the Quakers and their early theology, the only addition she cites in her essay is Nichols. So I'm as it were, it felt like an erasure.
Blame that on the editors.
Well, it is what it is. And so, in fact, in the bibliography, my edition is not listed under George Fox, although I thought he wrote the journal, he dictated it. It's actually attributed to me, as you can see there, under the article. So that's interesting. I share it with you. This is a puzzle, and I think part of the story here, and the reason why I want to raise the role of literary studies, is because I think what's been going on here is a kind of disciplinary siloing. And in fact, the people in literary studies who are interested in early Quaker history are they congregate around the John Bunyan Society. And the John Bunyan Society has a journal, and you'll hear papers, and they publish papers about early Friends writing there. I think I'm always in the business of trying to build bridges between different communities. And so I think we need to do something about this. And that's partly what my lecture is about. And when I have been involved in dissenting history of late, I've been trying to build bridges between the people who work on Anglo-American, or the people in the English-speaking world who work on Anglo-American dissenting tradition, and the people who work on Anabaptist and Mennonite history in Europe. And the bridge there is quite a few Canadians with Mennonite backgrounds. So there's more of that coming up in the lecture. I'm going to turn my phone back on so I've got a clock. I can see a clock there, though. That's not so bad. So let me make a confession of faith to get inside this. I came to the study of Quaker literature not through any family or personal background. There was a meeting house where I grew up in the boring suburb of Potters Bar in South Hertfordshire, on the edge of London. I did gain a strong interest in the 17th century by flitting between the local Anglican church dedicated to King Charles the Martyr, known by the local children. I had to walk past it every day to get to primary school, and it was known by the local children as King Charles Tomato, which is gorily appropriate. One was flitting between King Charles Tomato and the local Methodist church a few blocks away, either between Cubs and Scouts or going to the youth clubs. And that certainly put the meanings of the Reformation and how it is lived out in English or British history through time firmly in my imagination. It was as it was being fashioned as a kid. And at the University of Hull in the late 1970s, I met my first tutor, John Hoyles, and had thereby my first encounter with a real dissenter, the son of a Methodist prison reformer who'd been sent to Kingswood School, the Methodist boarding school where E.P. Thompson and a good deal of other Methodist radicals basically went. And he traded a vibrant Christian socialism for Maoist Marxism. But I think of him as a Christian Maoist, really, or a Methodist Maoist. He channeled in his lectures Christopher Hill's books, and there's no doubt, and Thompson's books, and there's no doubt that Hill's world turned upside down entirely inspired and dominated interest in 17th century history at that time in 1977 and 78, 5 and 6 years after the book had first appeared. I went to Oxford to do research and write a doctoral thesis on radical literature, and realized after a while that it wasn't Hill who was the key figure. He granted me an audience. He just retired, and he granted me an audience over a pint of beer. And I said I was very interested in how language was used by people. And I said metaphor mattered a lot to me. And he said, when you say metaphor, what is it that you mean? And I knew that we wouldn't have a lot to say to each other immediately. But nonetheless, a great man and a great figure. but in reading the scholarship, the person who was speaking to me most was Geoffrey Nuttall, G.F. Nuttall, whom I thought was no longer alive. Yeah. But I was able to contact him after I defended my thesis and had been examined, and probably that was good. And I went to visit him in his retirement flat in Bourneville, not far from Woodbrook College. I learned upon first meeting him, and he took me that afternoon in November 1986. He took me to the library at Woodbrook College, and we spent a couple of hours there looking at pamphlets. He told me that he had a fellowship there in the 1940s to finish off what most people regard as his greatest book, The Holy Spirit in Puritan Faith and Experience. And that's the blueprint for everything I did at the time. That was what really impressed me, for its grasp of its broad range. And he explained to me that he was from a congregational background and was a congregational minister, but his wife was a Quaker. He'd also become a friend, and the Holy Spirit was designed to draw links between the early Puritans and the Friends. And he said that wasn't offered. When he did it, he was resisted, because so much history of Puritanism and dissent was written from within distinct denominations, and the different groups didn't want connected history. They wanted virtuous histories of their own lineage, so to speak. And he was a true Christian radical, a pacifist and conscientious objector, a teetotaler, and a food radical. And I mean that. He refused to put milk on his cornflakes at breakfast, and put vitamin powder on them instead. And this was a matter of principle, as well as what he considered good for health. And those of you who have met him perhaps will share my view that I was in direct line with early dissent, that you were actually in some sense in direct contact. That somebody was so extraordinarily fixed in a point of view, and it was against the grain. A lot of my ideas in my first monograph, Perfection Proclaimed, about experience and immediacy, gained their final shape through a dialogue with Nuttall. And I actually think he'd like to think he was making me say what he wanted said. And I think in that first book, I didn't quite get my own voice back. I was so impressed by him. It certainly wasn't the way I would want to put a book together today. But it had a critical mass and a presence, and I think is regarded as a standard work, at least in literary studies and to some extent in history, because I claimed in the book that the publications of the radical Puritans made a coherent literary field, by which I mean a set of texts that had a kind of imaginative content which was entirely produced by their own theological quest for a kind of independence. And I did see the Quakers as a kind of logical endpoint of a quest to express a certain kind of selfhood, which, as Benjamin Furley would have seen very clearly, was clean away from any kind of priestcraft. You're away from the control of a trained clerisy, and therefore the sense of the divine, the sense of holiness, was coming directly out of the experience of the people. Although it was indeed Nuttall who put it into my head to edit Fox's journal, as well as a few discussions with Malcolm Thomas, who was at that point the librarian of Friends House in London. And Nuttall could tell I might have contacts with publishing people. So that's how it was done. And he persuaded me that isolating Fox's dictated narrative was a literarily worthwhile project. And it wouldn't matter if you dumped all the letters out of it and turned it into something else. And I was persuaded by that at the time. I'm not so sure now. But there are about quickly there are 8 points I make in the introduction that I think are unique characteristics of this particular literary autobiography, which might be one way of describing Fox's journal. One, the sense of amazement. Two, the documented encounters with radicals and various kinds of spiritualists along the way who matter to Fox. Three, the sense of a visionary life being there all the time. It's not switched on at particular moments. It is permanently there. Four, the sense of uncanniness, the uncanniness of experience, that everything mounts up and is contributing to the vocation. Fifthly, the use of not merely scripture language, but also rustic language in rather unusual ways. Sixthly, the fusion of the symbolic and the contingent, the quotidian and the highly important, as it were, are totally together. And a kind of, seventhly, a sense of, we might call it a degree zero of writing, that it totally abandons, as much early Quaker writing does, any sense of formality or any debt to institutional hierarchy. If you read George Herbert's poetry, it's full of reference to the structure of the Anglican Church and the insides of churches. And Fox is, of course, all against that. Bunyan famously fears that when he goes inside a steeple house, it will fall on him. That's his great existential anxiety. So he sits somewhere between Fox and George Herbert, if you will. Eighthly, Geoffrey and I were quite interested in the sense of breathlessness in the syntax, as Leonard Fell, the guy who did the dictation, gives it to us. The sense of Fox, as he's dictating it, picking up facts as his memory comes back to life, and the sentences go on and on and on, so that any attempt to edit Fox's journal means you've got to kind of insert punctuation so that readers can handle it today. Literary scholars, and I'm moving now to a section, literary scholars and some linguisticians pay close attention to what words do, their ability to facilitate deeply imaginative, unusual expression and to build compelling narratives or help make exciting performed drama. That would be the other, Shakespeare studies. Hilary Hines shows how unusually interruptive Friend's use of the spoken, written and printed word worked in her book about George Fox of 2013 that I referred to a few minutes ago. In the first years, this Quaker expression was regarded as deeply transgressive, almost always extravagant, and most disturbing. The sign of the order being profoundly disrupted. And I so enjoyed the first paper this morning because it tied it to, it gave you the economic consequences of such protest and that they were tied together. Now, Carla Pestana reproves me in my close reading of John Perrott for noting expression that may have been extravagant, but she notes that Perrott's ideas were merely standard Quaker ideas. Well, I think in the late 1650s and the early 1660s, Quaker ideas, they may be identifiably standard, but they were shocking to most people. And also, I think she misses the point. Perrott stood out because he was gesturally extravagant. That's the whole point of it. And that was a version of Quakerism that became untenable for the movement in its internal politics. Highly gestured language was what the Quakers were taken to be saying as a matter of substance. But I do think it's true, as Pestana suggests, that by being imprisoned in Rome between 1658 and 1661, Perrott missed the key organizational swift that Rosemary Moore so importantly documents in her book, giving the Quakers the capacity to survive. But his extravagant language of gestures is there before he's imprisoned, and unfortunately, it's still there after he's released. I suggested in Perfection Proclaimed, my first book, my first monograph, that early Quaker discourse was at an extreme among other groups. It occurs in a compressed 5-page section at the end of a first long chapter called Prophecy, Experience, and the Presentation of the Self. And I thought I'd done a ton of work on the Quakers when I was writing that book. And when I go back to that book, which I often, most of the time I don't do, I was quite shocked that I'd just written 5 pages on them. And so it embarrasses me now to read its difficult, inwoven, almost solipsistic, making sense only to itself section. I think that little 5-page section makes more sense if you read it as the end section of a complete and much longer chapter. But it is very hard to follow if you read it as it is, as I did last week. And I'm not surprised it receives little airplay. And I'm sure many people interested in Quaker history might have gone to it and given up because it's not clear what's going on. But nonetheless, what I do in that section is argue that there was no apparent first-person I as such, as you would find in most experiential writing, most spiritual autobiography, the kind of autobiography being produced as a matter of course. If you wanted to be a Congregationalist, you had to give a confession of experience at the point of joining the church to show that you had been saved and you were worthy of membership. I suggested with regard to Quaker discourse that this was an explicit silence of self, perhaps in parallel to the emergence of silent worship, but it's not clear that silent worship was fully developed at that point, as we've heard earlier this afternoon, and that the voice was the light within, a driven messianic language of the new calling. And this was in the final section of a long chapter in which I typified radical Puritan writing as on a sliding scale, where autobiography, known as the confession of experience, notably in the independent or congregational churches, moved into and towards the claim to speak with a prophetic voice, which is certainly what early Quaker writing is doing. The Quakers were beyond even this kind of fashioning of prophetic identity in their denunciative rhetoric that on the printed page looked like a level and equal, different, but inspired language. You know, those early Quaker pamphlets look very different to other pamphlets. There's a block of small print with perhaps a big leading letter. And you look at it and think, how is this meant to be read? And I think that was a strategy for making it look different. Nothing of the world's hierarchies appeared to be in it, even if it contained narratives of real world events, as if the speaking voice was thoroughly disembodied. You get a sense of where is this coming from? It's not necessarily in a sense coming from a body. And if you or anybody, and if you read it in the context of the way in which authorship is constructed in the printed book in the early modern period, the Quaker Tract is kind of rebellion against that. A very common example is how the playwrights got published. Shakespeare's plays were only published in collected form long after he died by people who knew him, and with a very difficult process of reconstruction of what he wrote. But 8 years before that, there's a very famous instance of Ben Jonson publishing his complete plays, because Ben Jonson is a raving egotist and made sure that he seized the chance to be a real author. He wanted to be known as a learned author rather than a mere playwright. And he settled for collected works. I think the first proper collected works of an English playwright. So that will be the absolute opposite in terms of proclaimed authorship to what a Quaker tract is doing. But at the same time, in the early phase of Quakerism, I did argue for the interconnectedness of expression in imagery and positioning of prophetic insight in Quaker writings vis-a-vis many other positions that you might have taken in the 1650s, comparing Fox, for instance, with Gerald Winstanley the Digger, and Isaac Pennington with one N, the younger, before he became a Quaker. I was at pains to show that many of the stylistic features of early Quaker style, as they have been described by Jackson Cope in a famous essay of the 1950s, were shared with other radicals. But this broad bandwidth, I think, was not taken up, certainly by Quaker scholars. It may have been taken up by the literary people. But it's not referred to at all by Michael Graves in his 2009 study of the Quaker sermon. To me, the idea of a Quaker sermon is almost a contradiction in terms compared with the way in which, you know, John Donne wrote sermons in a very ornate and elaborate way, informed by a huge paraphernalia of sermon writing instruction. I'm not sure what impact this work had, and Cope is certainly still quoted, although he claims in his article that scripture references are rare in Quaker tracts, but that's not true at all. And he meant 1650s, 1660s Quaker writings, and I think that can only be explained by the fact that he was used to a different form of reference, a much more obvious signed form of reference with a text in a margin. And I don't think he was paying attention to the way in which religious radicals just embody the Bible in their own way of writing a sentence. And while this mode of expression might appear to involve an absolute negation of a worldly self, some, like John Toll Derby, who was a Quaker for a while and then left, felt it was an underhanded way of being very egotistical. So he thought George Fox was in it for self, for the justifying of self. He says in The Foot Out of the Snare. And that's an interesting critique at that early moment, playing into the debate about selfhood. And there was a round denunciation of mysticism being having anything to do with early Quakerism. One of the terms in Rhineland mysticism in the German language is you've got to expel your sense of self in order to become one, to experience unio mystica, oneness with the Godhead. And the German word from that is Ichheit, Ihood. Now that is, strictly speaking, untranslatable in that no translation has taken hold. We aren't checking out our collective Ihood in this conference, but Ihood did exist as an English word in the 17th century, and it's part of the experiential language that was traded between seeker spiritualists in the middle of the 17th century, and I'm sure Fox would have come across it. So it's not true that there's no mysticism there. It was a trace through translation, and it was a textual realm that was explored. It just doesn't survive in that way with anyone in the English-speaking world. My defense of the value of a literary approach to the Friends takes us to poetry. And so I very much like the valuable chapter on the Quaker verse in Rosemary's Moore's The Light in Their Consciences, except that perhaps John Perrott was the greatest first generation Quaker poet. And I'd written about that. And I think Rosemary referred to my article somewhere else, but not in that chapter in her book. But so that essay about Perrott, which drew some frosty caution from Carla Pestana, but a warmer engagement from Michel Tarter, showed how Perrot's poem, which he wrote while he was being tortured by the Inquisition, A Sea of the Seeds Suffering, was a piece of adventurous Quaker writing, an allegory of selfhood, an allegory of Quaker selfhood, enduring not merely persecution, but even torture. But I also show how it's a learned poem. And so you'll think that Perrot was crazy, but he was actually really learned. And, you know, he read Sir Thomas Browne, the science writer. You think of him as a natural philosopher. I tried when I wrote about it to connect it with Milton's Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. The latter at least, Paradise Regained, in direct sympathy with the early Friends. I think there's no doubt about that. And based on the Perrot's poem, based on the enormously popular late 16th century French Protestant or Huguenot creation epic, Les Semains of Guillaume de Sallust Sieur du Bartas, everyone says du Bartas, who is widely imitated Huguenot poet, widely imitated in the English-speaking world and elsewhere in Protestantism, certainly in the Netherlands. Of course, a lot of attention has been paid to the possible Quaker presence in Milton's late and great poems, not least through the Blind Poets Association with his young amanuensis, Thomas Ellwood. As Nuttall would always say to me, Gentleman Tom, who helped with the dictation of the poetry as well as Milton's two daughters, and moved Milton out of London to Chalfont St Giles in Buckinghamshire. A recent article by Andrew Brown, there, 3 articles. This is my reading list for you. A recent article by Brown would be in a genre of studies of Paradise Regained, discusses Paradise Regained as in some sense a Quaker text through what appear to be alarmingly close allusions to the titles of Quaker pamphlets from the period of the persecution. Ellwood claims, no one takes it seriously, but Ellwood claims that he gave Milton the idea of writing Paradise Regained. So Milton gave him the manuscript of Paradise Lost. Then there was the plague and the fire, and they met again afterwards in Chalfont. And Ellwood said, "Thou hast said much of Paradise Lost, but what about Paradise Found?" Which is a good Quaker thing to say. And Milton said, "Oh, all right then, I'll handle that." Perrot himself knew natural philosophy and communicated with the Hartlib Circle, the forerunners of the Royal Society. But neither in her, so this may have resulted, so the fact that this chapter isn't, this work on Perrot hasn't left literary studies and gone very much into Quaker studies, may have resulted in a broader oblivion, so that in his otherwise excellent study of the 19th century Quaker poet and penal reformer Bernard Barton, 1784 to 1849, and opponent of the death penalty, that's Barton, Christopher Stokes claims in 2019 that there is no significant Quaker poetry in the 17th century. Utter nonsense. A lot of Quaker poetry is not necessarily good, but a lot of poetry, you know, is not very good. That's no great claim. And I think the Quakers always take a hit for that, because they're expected to write great poetry. But for the purposes of great poetry, Milton is a Quaker. I think certainly in Paradise Regained, I think you can legitimately, to some degree, accept that. And it's a great shame that Stokes doesn't note that I went into great detail about the connections between the interest in resurrecting the early Quaker texts in their original form amongst the Quakers, especially the scholarly Quakers, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, with the emergence of literary modernism. and the connection there is James Joyce in Ulysses, where there's a passage in which Stephen Dedalus, the hero, is in the library of Trinity College Dublin, and all of a sudden he falls into, as Lennon and McCartney say, I fell into a dream, and he sees Christ Fox in leather trews, and it's a vision of George Fox, but as the paragraph develops, it's George Fox spliced with Shakespeare, and it moves from a vision in the library of George Fox in his leather trousers and Shakespeare's neglected wife Anne Hathaway, and the sentence, and it's a Joycean huge sentence, and it ends with, and she was left alone in the country with little to support her, and so it takes a bit of unwrapping to find out what's going on, and I think that the explanation is there's an essay by Walt Whitman in which he wonders what a remarkable century the 17th century was that could produce both William Shakespeare and George Fox. But my interest here is that the great revolution in narrative technique of the modernists, in other words, capturing narrative that captures what you think, as it were, from moment to moment, as you are conscious, and gives it a shape, as opposed to a commonly agreed third-person narrative, the way of the 19th century novelists. George Eliot, perhaps the greatest, considered the greatest purveyor of that in the English language. That there's an interesting connection between the Quakers coming to consciousness of their legacy and the rise of interior narrative. I have a long correspondence with Geoffrey Nuttall. My letters are somewhere in the Dr. Williams Library archive to him. His letters, to me, I fear I've lost some of them in a transatlantic move and water damage, because I live in New Jersey. But I've got a good few of them, and he told me after a while, he said, did you notice all the allusions to Virginia Woolf in my letters to you? And I said, no. He said, but you're a literature scholar. But I wasn't expecting it. But then he told me that Virginia Woolf was his favorite reading while he was an undergraduate in Balliol College, Oxford, and she kept him going. And I realized that must have meant that the growing emergence of the Holy Spirit in Puritan faith and experience was happening spliced with this remarkably new form of writing. In other words, Virginia Woolf. And that's even amazing because there's a gender dimension to Virginia Woolf's fiction. There's a gender rebellion in her writing, which is commonly known about. So that's another dimension in modern literary studies, and that needs to be explored. So I'm trying to put back into your consciousnesses or into Quaker studies what some of the things I said, perhaps even in passing in that introduction in the Fox edition. Christopher Hill noted similar connections between Joycean modernist narrative technique and George Fox, and says in The World Turned Upside Down that the journal is a Joycean narrative, quote unquote. And there are, in fact, very considerable Quaker presences in English literature that remain untapped, but are a valuable resource for historians of the Quakers, quite apart from distinctive Quaker genres. So Hazel Wilkinson, last item on that list, has recently uncovered Richard Castleman's wreck-focused voyage. We heard about wrecks in the last paper. His wreck-focused voyage of 1726, once assumed to be fictional because it uses the genre of prose fiction as its model, but it is in fact a real account containing hitherto unknown information about do-good Quakers in colonial Virginia, who actually spend their time like, Boy Scout Quakers rescuing shipwrecked shipwrecked English people. And that's what the book is about. So I think, again, this was published in the Review of English Studies, Oxford University's journal. And I wonder how many Quaker historians actually read it. So I commend that to you. There is also the important feature of Quaker language usage and ideas of language that was not merely symbolic of a religious belief, but also of an ideological critique that was not only theological but economic. This has been picked up on the literary side of things. Thus, in an important, but I believe overlooked article of 2000, Mailing Hazleton, the reference is at the bottom, Mailing Hazleton in Money Chokes, the Quaker Critique of the 17th Century Public Sphere, argued that the early Friends, and especially George Fox, protested that the great evil, the beast, was the commodification of language, that in general speech acts were the possession of the privileged, and that was so in order to produce an extractive, oppressive social order at the expense of the poor, while lawyers and priests were enriched. So Mailing Hazleton, who very, very sadly is no longer alive, was an American Rhodes Scholar from Missouri, from St. Louis, Missouri. And she was my master's student in Oxford. And she went on to do a PhD, or to attempt to do a PhD at Harvard, but she never finished it. There's a tragedy in there, but I think this article is really important. And she writes, no, did I? No, I didn't. Okay. Yes, it's up there. It's the first quotation. Quakers sought to replace the old practice of rhetoric, inextricably linked to the social hierarchy, with a new community of speech. They sought a leveling of language that would free speech from commerce, verbal propriety from property. The Quakers' campaign for a redistribution of language is an argument for a more equitable allotment, and it echoes Winstanley's call for a communal ownership. Yet the Quakers also transcended earlier sophisticated understanding of language reform through language. I think the quotation is garbled, so forgive me. I'll send you all a corrected quotation tomorrow. I'll sort that out tonight. She sees in Fox an equation of the spiritual and the material. When Fox, she says, moves from the exhortation to speak freely, a description of labor in the vineyards, the description reads as a metaphor for the dissemination of the word of God. However, when he declares that the result of this free spiritual labor will be that there will be little cause to call the magistrates to give the workers maintenance, they will all have enough. The analogy between speech and manual labor seems to collapse into identity. The proposals that Fox made in a pamphlet addressed to Parliament in 1659 look as austere as Gerard Winstanley's Utopia. At first, the Quaker statement appears to be close to Gerard Winstanley, digger and mystical communist, but then she goes on, Fox echoed Winstanley, his calls for some redistribution of land, but his primary target was the buying and selling of language, which he believed was the key to the corruption of ministers, lawyers, and politicians. In other words, that's an argument that the Quakers were involved in an attack on the commodification of early modern information technology. And perhaps you should think about that in the way we think about who controls the internet and what happens in the internet and the uses to which it can be put. Suffering and persecution might include being compelled to pay a minister who baptized your child. Early Quaker discourse was thus beyond the leveler insistence on the propriety of self-ownership, with laws that protected that propriety, many of which we regard as basic to the way we live today, and on the digger desire for the abandonment of private property, and in a space where speech is free from the power relations and hence value-driven prejudices that infected the world. Whenever I've been to a Quaker meeting, which with Geoffrey Nuttall was a lot, to the Selly Oak meeting, much of what was said in that meeting could be connected to what I've just been saying. The explanation of Quaker critique that I've just recounted to you. In the context of 1640s radical writing, this was the truly original contribution of Quaker discourse, a freedom from oppression in the act of speaking that it was assumed would result in a rectification of inequalities. It was perhaps the greatest objection to priestcraft in the period. And one can see very clearly the appeal to a merchant like Benjamin Furley, who was convinced by James Parnell in 1655 at the age of 19 in Colchester. What I love about that is, you know, we've learned about Furley earlier today and how sophisticated he was and how brilliant being a merchant he was at moving between people from different parts of the very strongly stratified world in which he lived. But Parnell had been to a grammar school in Nottinghamshire, I believe, but he was, because he was convinced himself, I think when he was very young, still a teenager, and was called the teenage Quaker or something equivalent to that. His pamphlets are extremely, strikingly messianic and shocking, and I'm not surprised that he was. I mean, it's tragic the way, you know, he was treated appallingly badly in Colchester Castle and locked up in tiny spaces. Eventually died, and people weren't allowed to give him food and so on. You can understand how he would have scared the living daylights out of it. And I think it's very interesting that Furley, who was basically an upper middling sort merchant, and Furley's father and his brother were also convinced at the same time. So that's a very interesting conjunction that fits with what I'm saying about the commodification of language. And I've been reading a lot of Furley's letters to John Locke, with whom he was very close. And clearly, for Furley, priestliness is the worst thing about the status quo and why Quakerism is needed. It's 8:29, and I'm about to enter section 2. I wonder, section 2 is actually not too long. It's going to take probably 5 or 6 minutes. Can I do that? And then I can do something that would correspond to the lecture description. So after the trauma of the Restoration, the adoption of the organization structure by the Friends and their much less abrupt and denunciatory approach, and its replacement by a far more politically effective means of solicitation and persuasion. We might say that Quakerism appealed more broadly as a more pleasant, understandable destination for many. And so this section is appropriately called Everyone a Quaker. As is well known, there were some famous converts in the Restoration years, even while the Quakers were suffering their worst persecution in history, like Anne Conway, Lady Conway, and the alchemist genius Baron from Belgium, the Baron from Belgium, Francis Mercurius van Helmont. That a power of godliness, something divine, was felt to be in people, animating them, something that you could get at without needing a clerisy or needing to go to church. That, I think, is what was commonly accepted and became a point of interest during the period of the Great Persecution, and widely registered, and part of an intensely felt debate amongst rationalists, empiricists, and materialists, the new fashions in philosophy. And a good example, close to Quakerdom, is the philosopher theologian Damaris Cudworth. She was the daughter of Damaris Cudworth was the daughter of the influential and immensely learned Ralph Cudworth, Cambridge Platonist and master of Clare College and Christ College. And in 1685, she married Sir Francis Masham, who was an Essex country squire. She became a great friend, however, long before she married Masham, of John Locke, and many people think John Locke was her real beau. And she clicked with John Locke. And they had a great, there's a lot of letters between them. And in their correspondence, a significant difference of opinion emerged during a discussion of the Cambridge Platonist John Smith's posthumously published Select Discourses of 1660, one of the most successful Platonist publications. And we should think about this in the context of another Cambridge Platonist and the leading Cambridge Platonist, Henry More, and his approval in the mid-1670s of Quaker piety. And he wrote in a letter to William Penn that after the publication of Berkeley's Quaker theology, the Quakers have proved that they can match any theology, and that it was real Christian theology and it was good enough for him. And they got beyond. He always found a shortfall in the other versions of spiritualistic theology that the Quakers might be lined up with, and familism, which we don't need to go into because we have no time. But the familists were, their writings were well known to Henry More, and he saw a quality difference by the time we get to the 1670s in Quaker writing and familist writing. So what I'm saying is there's not a whole lot of difference between what interests Cambridge Platonists and the people who read them and the Quakers, and they're in a common world of discourse. Are non-rational elements of human experience to be listened to? Do they tell us something about ourselves? Or are they a complete irrelevance, nothing to do with what we and the world really are? Are they merely unfortunate epiphenomena of the way we're constructed? There is a common disapproval of the claim for direct inspiration by the Holy Spirit in the correspondence between Damaris, Cudworth, and Locke, or that claim for inspiration known as enthusiasm, widely condemned in the period, with a fearful retrospective glance at the more extreme Puritans, including, of course, the Quakers of the Civil War period, and which was widely blamed for causing and extenuating such a disastrous period. And she says, I think I have this in a quotation, she says to Locke, "We are agreed in the opinion of enthusiasm, to which I hope I am as much an enemy as you." He thought that she was an enthusiast, and she's trying to tell him she's not, but she was. Heavily mediated by Joseph Glanville's writing, Cudworth does not deny that God can influence his people and communicate with them, but the enthusiast is for her apparently mistaken in judgment. She says, I suppose is their great mistake, that there being no suggestions of the Holy Spirit, but what are always what are always agreeable to, if not demonstrable from reason. In other words, they'll claim anything is the inspiration of the Holy Spirit if they feel like it. She maintained that an appeal to reason was always necessary, but that one could know, and here's the interesting bit, one could know, appreciate, and derive benefit from something above human reason that was in our experience, but that was not yet quite wholly of the divine. But Locke, however, was unremitting and suspected enthusiasm in her position. I hope they will not be his, that's to say, John Smith's fourth position, which is to deal truly with you, seemed to me to very much savor of enthusiasm, and so will be very little different from my visionaries. I mean, in respect of their opinions and knowledge. I have a page to go. These men may exhibit seraphic love and heroic virtue, excellent pious qualities, but irrelevant in a discussion concerning the distinction of men in respect of knowledge. The month before, on the 3rd of March, 1682, he had accused her of enthusiasm for a second time. With some care, she defended herself, arguing that while enthusiasts abandon reason, there are pious people who do not, and yet are open to acknowledging personal religious experiences that can only be judged by the sentient and vital faculties. And she goes on to say that who is she or anyone to deny these experiences to anyone who is both virtuous and rational? So she reveals a sort of tolerant side to herself there. Locke would greatly expand the content of his correspondence with Cudworth by going into exile in the Dutch Republic as things turned bad in the latter part of Charles II's reign for the Whigs, basically. And as many of you know, Locke was basically the personal the secretary to the Earl of Shaftesbury, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, who was the leader of the Whigs. And he stayed most of his time in Rotterdam with Benjamin Foley. And as time went by, Masham wanted to distance herself from any charge that she was inspired by raptures and be considered one of what she calls the metaphysical contemplative people. This has been seen by some as evidence of Locke's growing influence on her. And by this group, she meant the Cambridge Platonists, who sort of did believe in a spirit life, and among whom her father ranked prominently. And she speaks warmly of their virtuous and friendly gentility. And I think that's quite important. And, you know, she was raised basically in the master's lodgings first at Clare College, then at Christ's College in the Garden. You remember that Christ's College is Milton's college. And it was also Henry More's college. So Henry More was basically an undergraduate at Christ's College, more or less at the same time as Milton. But More was, Milton left to follow his poetic star, if you will, and More stayed on to be a tutor, and then to become Oliver Cromwell's preferred churchman. That's the way it worked out by the 1650s. I pick up in Cudworth Masham a restlessness in her own thoughts after the period in 1682 when she thought she would be a philosophical Stoic. She also became interested in speculation on aging and wondered whether she could bear with Van Helmont's view that God had given people 1,000 years to redeem themselves. And he advanced the theory of reincarnation within that 1,000 years, which he'd got out of Pythagorean theory. And in the discussions overseen by Anne Lady Conway at Ragley Hall in Warwickshire, George Keith, big Quaker, big Scottish Quaker, substituting for William Penn on a particular visit, appears to have inherited these ideas on transmigration from a discussion directly with Van Helmont, at the point at which Van Helmont was being persuaded to be a Quaker, at least for a while. And at the same time, Van Helmont and Keith were sharing an enthusiasm for Kabbalistic thought, which Michael Burkle has explored in an excellent article in the volume on early Quaker theology. So I take seriously in this context Madeline Pennington's, no relation as it were with the town, Madeline Pennington's argument in her recent book on Quakers and the Enlightenment, that it was in the Ragley discussions that Berkeley developed his idea of the divine essence being present in mankind through that part of the Godhead that is Jesus Christ, adopting in this instance a very Trinitarian formulation. An important part of an ongoing elaboration of a Quaker ontology and metaphysics. And here it's important to note that Pennington is correcting the views of the editor of the Conway letters, the correspondence of Lady Conway and her circle, which is how we get to know about these remarkable encounters. Marjorie Hope Nicholson, who was an English literature professor of the intellectual historian kind at Columbia University in New York City, and Nicholson's fundamental, Nicholson didn't see this side of the debate. Nonetheless, her view remains unchallenged that the Quakers were part of a revolt against the non-essentials in religion, and that the movement was, through the idea of the light within, part of a growing optimism, even part of what is called the decline of hell. And I mentioned Marjorie Hope Nicholson's work because she was an influential American English literature professor at an early stage of its life as a discipline in the mid-17th century, in the mid-20th century. If I'm trying to make you see disciplinary connections, her place in this would have a major part. But as I must now draw to a conclusion, where I disagree quite strongly with Madeline Pennington is that the context to see the second phase of Quaker thought in this capacious, highly successful venturing into different spheres in which George Fox, who is just about still alive when it begins, has become an elder statesman. And is, the crucial thing, I think, is the publication of the journal, which makes what he was live on in an important way. The correct context, Madeline Pennington wants to see the Quakers, the ontology of the early Quakers as ending in the Enlightenment. But I can't, the Enlightenment might be represented in John Locke. And apart from toleration, which Locke famously theorized in his letter, there's the suspicion of enthusiasm does not fit at all with Quaker spirituality. It is plain against it. The real context at this time for Quakerism is the rise of pietism in Europe. The pietists in Germany and what's called in the Netherlands the Nadere Reformatie, the later Reformation, the rise of a quest for spiritual meaning for the Germans over and against a version of Lutheranism that had become dryly legalistic. And so the interest in an emotional religion. That's where the Quakerism goes. What's so impressive about Furley is that he's like, the best surfer in the world. And he seems to be able to surf big curlers, or whatever they're called, in different spheres to navigate in rationalism, in republicanism. The final move I would make, and I can't get there in this lecture, I can answer questions about it. I'm very interested, and I've been working on what the Quakers got up to in the Netherlands, and it's usually presented as it was presented earlier today as a bit of a failure, that they didn't attract many converts, but the obvious community to go into would be the Mennonites, but they were very, very well established by that time. And the Mennonites in the cities of Holland were very wealthy. They were proscribed. They couldn't hold a public office because they were Mennonites and not members of the Dutch Reformed Church. But they were very wealthy, or many of them were very wealthy merchants and heavily involved in the printing industry. They cornered the market in translation, and they were happy. And they, unlike the English Baptists who got raided by the Quakers, who were not happy, it wasn't working for them. And the forum that the Quakers went into were the collegian churches, which were not churches for worship. They were discussion groups of people from different faiths. The idea was that everyone who went to a collegiate meeting could go to it if they believed in a God. Jews, Sephardic Jews who'd gone to live in Amsterdam, including the young Spinoza, sometimes attended these meetings. The whole idea was not to bust somebody else's faith and convert them to your own, but to listen to them. So if you have a messianic evangelical religion, it's not going to work. And that's why in the 1650s, when the first group of Quakers went over, William Ames being one of them, they didn't meet the success. And when the young William Caton went further to Cologne, he said he left a lot of his blood behind. So Cologne was in Catholic Germany, and a lot after the signing of the Treaty of Munster, and I think the priests came out of the churches and beat him up, and he had to leave. And he made the mistake of assuming that because there was a big Dutch enclave in Cologne, it would be like being in Amsterdam, and it wasn't. So there's been a lot of interest for many years that various people have been interested in was Baruch Spinoza's philosophy, which is perhaps regarded as the most exciting early modern philosophy now by people who are interested in redeploying philosophy. Was it, in a sense, indebted to Quaker critique? Samuel Fisher's critique of the Bible seems to align with Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. And is their version of the light within, did that have an impact on Spinoza's shockingly iconoclastic Ethica? and Laura Ridees, who is a Quaker scholar, a philosopher, I think in upstate New York, has been working at trying to show how Ames's tract in Furley's, no, there's a tract which was once attributed to Ames called The Light of the Candlestick. Furley did an English translation. It was in Andrew's PowerPoint presentation. She's argued that that treatise, which was written by a friend of Spinoza's, a Mennonite called Peter Balling, was influenced by Ames. And I haven't made my mind up about that yet, though I think it's an important argument. There's a missing text in there that needs to be read. Usually in Quaker history, the Mennonites are considered to be rather pernickety towards them and not interested. I actually think that the Quaker, the Mennonite who keeps turning up, the senior Mennonite, is a man called Hylanus Abrahams. And he, I think, kept going back to the Quakers because he was trying to hear what they were saying. And in the big meeting in the 1670s, is it 1677, when Fox went to the Netherlands with Penn and Keith, and perhaps Berkeley as well. It was a serious embassy. He kept appearing and listening to them, and I think he was just trying to get them straight. I don't think he knew English. And so there would have had to have been some kind of Latin, usually a Latin mediation. And the interesting thing here is that Furley and Stephen Crisp were excellent Dutch speakers because they came from Colchester, which had a Dutch expatriate, a Dutch exclave of merchants. Stephen Crisp's wife was part of that. She was a Dutch lady in that community and became a convinced friend. Crisp actually, Furley's, I think he was twice married, and his second wife, I think she was from the Netherlands itself, but she was a Dutch Quaker. So I think the real picture is an interface between Mennonites and Quakers, and that it can only have been that way. And I suspect with several people moving between the two. And there is a history, it's much lamented in the Netherlands, a history by Cornelis Hilkemer, which Geoffrey Nuttall wrote a kind of summary of in English in the mid-1650s, and that's the only work that tried to map a history of that. So I would say the time is right to return to that book and make more sense of it. So that's where I'm at now, and all I'm doing is I'm trying to use the method I've developed and been given in my career as a literary critic, but being profoundly drawn to Quaker studies, and I'm waiting to. I'm very much hoping to do something on the Anglo-Dutch side with the Quakers and their impact next. I think it's an interesting story that remains to be told. So that's it. Thank you for listening.